Today we're looking at preliminary cost and time estimates and how these can be done early on in a project when you don't really have all that much information yet. By the end of this topic, you will be able to explain what the analogous and parametric estimating methods are, list some typical types of costs, explain the importance of whole-of-life costing, and describe typical time restriction scenarios and milestones. Firstly, let's look at the two main estimating methods you can use in the very early stages of a project. Firstly, the analogous method. The analogous method is an approach where you can use a similar past project that is very similar and comparable to the new project. This gives you a good starting point to work with, provided the past project is actually similar and is relatively recent. The parametric method is where you pick one particular aspect or parameter of the project and use a price per that parameter to build up an estimated total. There is a third method called bottom-up, and we'll look at that later on in this course. So moving on to some typical costs. Let's look at some broad categories of costs first. The broad categories that make up the total cost, and so always need to be included, are direct costs plus indirect costs plus contingency plus any profit equals total cost. Let's look at each in turn. A direct cost is a cost that goes directly into making the product or doing the work directly involved in the project. This could include materials used and directly consumed by the project, equipment used and fully consumed, or direct labour costs. Essentially, it's everything that is consumed by the project and never seen again. For example, when making a special one-off takeaway pizza, the direct costs include the food items used, the cardboard box it goes into, and the labour costs incurred by the person directly making the pizza. An indirect cost, on the other hand, is something that helps the project move forward but is not fully consumed by the project. So it can be reused later on in future projects, such as hired equipment. For our pizza example, the oven and its running costs are indirect because they get reused in future projects, as well as any salary for managers. Indirect costs are also known as preliminaries or overheads. Then we have the contingency. This is probably a new term for you and one you'll need to use often within the course. A contingency is either a money or a time allowance put aside to pay for unforeseen things in the future. For our pizza example, there could be a contingency put aside for extra food items in case the person making the pizza spills some. And then we have the profit. Not all clients who start a project are there to make a profit. For example, a government agency doesn't normally make a profit from their projects, but many private companies do. Or sometimes the intended profit is a long-term goal and it isn't part of the project itself. So sometimes the profit might be zero. But in many projects there is a profit allowed still for the contractors and consultants. So how are these four cost categories related to the two estimating methods? It's important just to make sure that those four categories are allowed for. Sometimes if a parametric method is used, it might only allow for the direct costs, and so you would have to add in the indirect costs, contingency, and profit on top in order to get the total. Alternatively, if the analogous method is used, it might have already allowed for the direct, indirect, and profit, but not the contingency, so you would need to add that item on top. So this gives us our total project cost, but a good project manager does need to think about whole-of-life costing. By whole-of-life costing, we mean the project costs plus the operation and maintenance costs. In construction, this could sometimes be a 50-50 split, or sometimes the operation and maintenance could be up to 80% of the total. So the whole-of-life costing is especially important for any client who has to manage the product produced after the project ends. For example, a building developer who will own and manage a building for 30 or 40 years after the construction project is finished, or a government type client who owns the building or product. It is quite a common occurrence where a project will spend more on the project costs in order to save money on the long-term running costs. This is a big part of why so many buildings are being built as green or sustainable buildings nowadays. It might cost more at the start, but it can be a big financial win in the long term. This concept of whole-of-life costing is something that all project managers need to have in the back of their mind when looking at project costs and estimates, especially when deciding between a cheap, lower quality option and a more expensive but better quality option. So moving on to our prelim time estimates now. There are 3 common scenarios for a project end date. Scenario 1 is a fixed end date that cannot move, such as an event like New Year's Eve or the Olympics. Scenario 2 is when there is an ideal end date, but it does have a little flexibility. This is fairly common in the building industry. Scenario 3 is a project that can finish whenever it does based on realistic durations. You might think this sounds like common sense, but it isn't as common as you would expect. During this course, we won't focus on any of those scenarios specifically, but it's important for a project manager to look at the time restrictions for any project and relate them back to the iron triangle and the different priorities a project might have. Another very important aspect of time estimates are key milestones. These should be an integral part of the planning for each and every project. So what is a milestone? It's a key event that happens at a particular point in time, and it represents a significant achievement in the project, normally the start or finish of a significant portion of work. Think of it like a snapshot. A milestone does not have its own time duration. It doesn't last for a few days or weeks. It's a point in time. Similarly, it doesn't have its own cost. You have either met the milestone or you have not. It's like running a race. You've either finished the race or you haven't. There's no halfway in meeting a milestone. So if we look at a project timeline, a project will normally have a kickoff milestone and also a project completion milestone. Then there will be some milestones in between. You might be tempted to have a heap of milestones right at the end of a project because lots of significant events do happen at that point. But then how do you track progress during the previous parts of the project? Instead, it is good practice to spread the milestones out. Wherever a natural event happens that represents a significant portion of work being completed. A really common point of confusion is between a milestone and an activity. They are not the same thing. An activity or a task normally has some time and a cost associated with it. Some examples are building a timber frame for a house, designing something, waiting for an approval. These are activities. They have a time associated with them. They could be rewritten though as milestones, such as frame being finished, design completed, approval received. Note that the milestone is commonly for when a task is finished. So to wrap it up, let's look at some review questions. Number 1, explain the difference between analogous and parametric estimating. Number 2, list the 4 broad categories of costs that are part of a total project cost. Number 3, what is a milestone and how is it different to an activity? Make sure you answer these questions and bring them along to the week 2 tutorial. And now you can move on to the next video about stakeholder identification.